This 1887 Asylum garden photo looks peaceful until you see the hands. It hung for decades in the conference room of a psychiatric hospital foundation, framed in oak, a symbol of enlightened care. The matron in her dark dress stands proud. The patients sit serene on painted benches. Until one lawyer, looking for something else entirely, noticed that three women in the front row have their hands wrapped in thick white cloth. And when you look closer at the photograph under magnification, you can see faint circular marks on their wrists where metal had been, marks too uniform to be accidental. Sarah Vollmer found the photograph in March 2019, not because she was looking for it, but because she was looking for anything. She worked as a legal researcher for a class action firm in Albany that had been retained by descendants of women committed to institutions across New York State between 1870 and 1920. The case alleged wrongful confinement, abuse, and the systemic use of immigrant and poor women as unpaid labor under the guise of medical treatment. The firm needed evidence, and Vollmer had spent 4 months in dusty hospital archives and county historical societies, pulling every document that might prove the plaintiff's ancestors had been held without just cause. The Hudson Valley State Hospital for the Care of the Insane had closed in 1994. Its records had been transferred in stages to 3 different locations: the State Archives in Albany, a medical museum in Poughkeepsie, and the basement of a regional historical society in a town 40 minutes north of the old hospital grounds. Vollmer went to the Historical Society last, expecting little. Most of the materials there were not official patient files, which were protected, but public relations materials, photographs meant for donors, architectural drawings, and newsletters the hospital had produced for the community. She spent 2 days sorting through boxes of yellowed pamphlets that bragged about moral treatment, fresh air, and the healing power of useful work. The photograph was loose in a folder labeled Grounds and Gardens, 1885 to 1890. There were a dozen images in the folder, all showing well-tended flower beds, vegetable plots, and groups of women posed in sunlight. In most of the images, the women wore the same shapeless gray dresses. In this one, they wore better clothing, long skirts and high-collared blouses, as if they had been dressed for the occasion. The back of the photograph carried a stamp: J. W. Morris, photographer, Rhinebeck, NY, established 1881. Someone had written in pencil, South Garden, June 14, 1887, Dr. Haywood and staff. The photograph was large, 8 by 10 inches, mounted on thick cardstock. It had been carefully posed. 12 women sit on 2 long benches. Behind them, a man in a dark suit, presumably Dr. Haywood, stands beside 2 women in nurses' uniforms. Everyone looks at the camera. The garden is lush, roses climb a trellis, the light is soft. Vollmer almost moved on. Then she saw the hands. 3 women in the front row have their hands resting in their laps, but their fingers are entirely wrapped in white cloth, bound tightly from knuckle to wrist. The wrapping is neat, almost clinical, but it is heavy, the kind of bandaging that immobilizes. Vollmer leaned closer. The women's faces are expressionless, not sad, not defiant, just blank. She pulled out her phone and took several photographs of the photograph, zooming in on the hands, on the wrists visible just above the cloth. That is when she saw them. Thin, pale lines encircling both wrists of each of the 3 women, as if something metal had pressed into their skin for so long that even after removal, the marks remained. She sat back in her chair. The reading room of the Historical Society was empty except for the volunteer at the front desk. Vollmer looked at the photograph again. This was not a picture of healing. This was a picture of performance. The women had been unshackled just long enough for the camera, their hands wrapped to hide the damage, positioned in a garden to suggest tranquility. She felt a tightness in her chest, the same feeling she got when a document revealed something ugly that had been deliberately hidden. This was not just an old photograph. This was evidence. Vollmer had been doing legal research for 6 years, first as a paralegal, then as a specialist in historical documentation for litigation. She had worked on cases involving factory conditions, child labor, and discriminatory housing practices, always chasing the paper trail that proved what institutions denied. She had learned to read between the lines of annual reports, to notice the gaps in ledgers, to mistrust any image that looked too perfect. Asylum photographs, she knew, were propaganda. In the 1880s, state hospitals were under constant scrutiny. Reformers demanded investigations, newspapers published exposés, families threatened lawsuits, hospital administrators fought back with tours, open houses, and carefully staged photographs that showed clean wards, smiling patients, and productive labor. The images were meant to reassure legislators and donors that their money was being spent on humane care. But humane care did not leave marks like that. She photographed the back of the print, the stamp, the penciled note. She checked the folder for anything else. There was a second photograph from the same day, a wider shot of the garden with fewer people, and a third image showing women working in a vegetable plot, their backs to the camera. None of those images showed wrapped hands or visible restraint marks. She made notes. Dr. Haywood, June 1887, South Garden, J.W. Morris photographer. Then she asked the volunteer at the desk if there were any other records related to the Hudson Valley State Hospital. The volunteer, a retired librarian named Pauline, pulled out a binder with an inventory list. There were 10 more boxes, mostly correspondence and financial records that had not been processed yet. Vollmer asked to see them. Pauline hesitated, said they were not cataloged, but Vollmer explained she was working on a legal matter, and Pauline softened. She brought out 2 boxes that afternoon. Vollmer stayed until closing. In the second box, she found a letter dated July 1887 from Dr. James Haywood to the hospital's Board of Trustees. The letter described a successful visit by a delegation from the State Board of Charities, which had toured the grounds in mid-June, observed the patients in the gardens, and left with a favorable impression. Dr. Haywood wrote that the visit had been carefully prepared, that the most presentable patients had been selected, and that the photographer's images would be useful in the hospital's upcoming funding appeal. He did not mention restraints. He did not mention unwrapping anyone's hands. But the timing matched. The photograph had been taken on June 14th, and the delegation had visited in mid-June. The performance had been for them. Over the next 2 weeks, Vollmer built a file. She found J.W. Morris in the 1880 census, a photographer in Rhinebeck, about 12 miles south of the hospital. She located his studio advertisement in an 1886 county directory: portraits, group photographs, institutional work. Morris had done commercial photography for schools, churches, and hospitals. He was not an investigative photographer. He was hired help. She found records showing that the hospital had paid Morris $35 in June 1887 for photographic services. She found Dr. Haywood in medical directories. He had been superintendent of the Hudson Valley State Hospital from 1884 to 1892, trained at Bellevue, published 2 papers on the management of excitable female patients, both of which recommended restraint as a first resort rather than a last one. Then she found the admission ledgers. The state archives had digitized portions of the hospital's records, including intake logs from 1880 to 1890. Vollmer cross-referenced the photograph's date and requested the names of all Fieschalin patients admitted between 1885 and 1887 who were still in residence in June 1887. There were 43 names. She could not identify the women in the photograph by sight, but she could narrow the list by looking at admission notes and diagnosis fields. Of the 43, 19 had been committed for reasons that would not be considered medical today: troublesome behavior, refusal of marital duties, excessive grief, willfulness, immigrant excitability. 11 of those 19 were listed as having been placed in mechanical restraint at some point during their stay. Vollmer called a historian she had worked with on a previous case, Dr. Lena Garrison, who taught at a state university and specialized in the history of women's asylums. Garrison agreed to meet her at a cafe in Albany. Vollmer brought her laptop and showed her the photograph. Garrison leaned in, studied the image, then sat back. She said she had seen photographs like this before. In the 1880s, mechanical restraints were standard practice in most state hospitals, despite reformers' objections. Women were restrained for being loud, for refusing food, for trying to leave, for arguing with staff. The restraints included wrist and ankle cuffs, canvas jackets, and leather straps that tied patients to beds or chairs. Some women spent months in restraints. Garrison said that when inspectors or donors visited, staff would remove the restraints temporarily, dress the patients in better clothes, and stage scenes of therapeutic activity. The wrapped hands, Garrison explained, were likely covering abrasions, bruising, or open wounds caused by the metal cuffs. If the marks were visible in a photograph meant for public consumption, the real injuries must have been worse. Garrison pulled up her own files on her phone. She showed Vollmer an 1889 report by a nurse named Catherine Wells, who had worked briefly at a hospital in Pennsylvania and then published a pamphlet accusing the institution of abusing patients under the guise of treatment. Wells described women kept in wrist restraints for weeks at a time, their hands swelling, their skin breaking down, infections setting in. She described the ritual of cleaning up before inspections, restraints removed, wounds bandaged, patients threatened into silence. The pamphlet had caused a minor scandal, but Wells had been discredited as a disgruntled employee, and the hospital's board had issued a rebuttal claiming her testimony was exaggerated. No charges were ever filed. Vollmer asked Garrison if there was any way to identify the specific women in the photograph. Garrison said it would be difficult without names written on the image, but if Vollmer could cross-reference admission dates, physical descriptions in the intake notes, and discharge or death records, she might be able to narrow it down. She also suggested looking for any internal hospital correspondence from that period, particularly anything written by nurses or attendants, who sometimes kept more detailed notes than the official records showed. Vollmer went back to the Historical Society and requested the remaining boxes. Pauline, now curious, helped her go through them. In the fourth box, they found a small ledger labeled Daily Ward Notes, Female Department, 1887. The notes were brief, written by the head matron, a woman named Mrs. Alcott. Most entries were mundane: patients quiet today, 2 refused breakfast, laundry completed. But in the weeks leading up to June 14, 1887, the tone shifted. On June 8, Mrs. Alcott wrote, "Told to prepare South Ward for inspection visit. Dr. H. selected 12 patients for garden presentation. Restraints to be removed. Morning of 14th. Clean dresses distributed. On June 13th, patients bathed and inspected. 3 require hand wrapping due to condition of wrists. Dr. H. approved." There it was. The 3 women with wrapped hands had been in restraints so long that their wrists could not be shown uncovered, even for a staged photograph. Vollmer took photographs of every page. She returned to the admission ledgers and began the painstaking work of matching the timeline. Of the 19 women committed for non-medical reasons, she focused on those who had been admitted in 1885 or 1886 and were still listed as residents in mid-1887. She found 3 whose intake notes mentioned resistant or uncooperative behavior, the kind of language that typically preceded restraint orders. Their names were Anna Dietrich, age 26, committed April 1886. Reason: refusal of wifely duties, violent temperament. Margaret Coyle, age 31, committed September 1885. Reason: melancholia and insubordination. Rose Kaminsky, age 23, committed January 1886. Reason: hysteria, immigrant, no family support. Vollmer requested their full case files from the state archives under a legal subpoena connected to the class action. It took 3 weeks. When the files arrived, they were thin, just a few pages each, but what they contained was damning. Anna Dietrich had been committed by her husband, a factory foreman, after she refused to live with him following the death of their infant daughter. The commitment papers, signed by a single physician who had examined her for 10 minutes, stated she was a danger to herself. Once inside the hospital, she tried to leave multiple times. Each escape attempt was met with longer periods of restraint. By the time of the photograph, she had been in wrist cuffs for 8 consecutive weeks. Margaret Coyle had been committed by her brother after she protested the terms of their father's will, which left her nothing. The diagnosis was melancholia, but the intake note mentioned that she had threatened legal action against her brother. Rose Kaminsky, a Polish immigrant, had been committed by a local judge after she was found sleeping in a train station. She spoke limited English. The intake form listed no mental illness, only homeless, foreign, no means of support. She had been placed in restraints after shouting at staff in Polish. None of these women were insane. They were inconvenient, and the photograph, which hung in a hospital boardroom as proof of compassionate care, was a lie. Vollmer added the photograph and the case files to the evidence file for the lawsuit, but she knew the fight was just beginning. The case was being brought against the state of New York, arguing that thousands of women had been wrongfully confined in state hospitals between 1870 and 1920, that their labor had been exploited, and that they had been subjected to cruel treatment under policies that violated their civil rights. The state's defense had been consistent. The hospitals operated according to the medical standards of the time. Commitment procedures followed the law, and any abuse was the result of isolated incidents, not systemic policy. The photograph, Vollmer believed, could counter that defense. It was not an isolated incident. It was a planned deception orchestrated by a hospital superintendent, executed by his staff, and documented by a hired photographer. It showed that the hospital knew restraints caused harm, knew that harm had to be hidden, and chose to hide it rather than stop the practice. In October 2019, Vollmer's firm filed an amended complaint that included the photograph as Exhibit 27. The complaint identified Anna Dietrich, Margaret Coyle, and Rose Kaminsky by name, traced their descendants, and argued that the photograph was proof that the hospital engaged in systematic concealment of abuse. Within a week, the state's attorneys filed a motion to exclude the photograph, arguing that it was not relevant to the claims, that the identities of the women in the image could not be definitively proven, and that introducing the photograph would be prejudicial. The motion was denied. The judge ruled that the photograph, combined with the hospital's own internal records, was admissible evidence of institutional practices. The state then shifted strategy. In November, the Attorney General's office approached the firm with a settlement offer. They would not admit wrongdoing, but they would agree to a mediated process, a public records review, and the creation of a memorial fund for descendants. The offer was carefully worded. It acknowledged that certain practices, acceptable at the time, would not meet modern standards, but it stopped short of calling those practices abusive or illegal. Vollmer's firm consulted with the plaintiffs. Some wanted to push for trial. Others, exhausted by years of litigation, wanted resolution. The firm's senior partners scheduled a meeting to discuss strategy. The meeting took place in a conference room in Albany on a cold afternoon in early December. 12 people attended. 4 attorneys from the firm, 3 representatives of the plaintiff families, 2 historians including Dr. Garrison, a state archivist, a representative from the Attorney General's office, and a hospital advocate from a nonprofit that worked with mental health institutions. The photograph was projected on a screen at the front of the room. Everyone could see the women on the benches, the doctor and nurses standing behind them, the roses on the trellis. Everyone could see the wrapped hands. The Attorney General's representative, a calm man in his 50s named Douglas Tarrant, opened by saying the state was willing to negotiate, but that the case involved complex questions about historical context and legal standards that had changed over 130 years. He said the photograph was striking, but that it did not by itself prove a system of wrongful confinement. He noted that mechanical restraints were widely used in the 1880s, that many physicians believed they were therapeutic, and that the state could not be held liable for practices that were considered acceptable by the medical community of the time. He suggested that any settlement should focus on education and remembrance rather than liability. One of the plaintiff representatives, a woman named Joan Dietrich, who was Anna Dietrich's great-great-granddaughter, interrupted him. She said her ancestor was not mentally ill. She said Anna had been locked up for grieving her child and refusing to return to a man who blamed her for the death. She said Anna spent 2 years in that hospital, most of it in restraints, and died there in 1889 of general debility, which Joan believed was starvation or infection. She pointed at the photograph and said, "That is my family's history. You do not get to call that acceptable." Dr. Garrison spoke next. She walked the room through the evidence. The admission records, Mrs. Alcott's notes, Dr. Haywood's letters, the pattern of commitments across dozens of cases. She explained that the legal standard for commitment in New York in the 1880s was disturbingly low, that women could be committed on the word of a single physician, that many were held without any possibility of appeal, and that hospitals had financial incentives to keep beds full because their funding was based on patient counts. She said the photograph was not an anomaly. It was standard operating procedure. She said there were likely hundreds of similar images in archives across the state, all showing stage scenes meant to hide what was really happening inside those institutions. The hospital advocate, a woman named Dr. Yolanda Rice, pushed back gently. She said modern psychiatric hospitals were trying to atone for the past, that they had implemented patient rights protections, that involuntary commitment now required judicial review. She said demonizing the entire history of mental health care made it harder to build public trust in current institutions. She acknowledged that abuses happened, but cautioned against framing the entire system as malicious. Vollmer, who had been silent until then, spoke up. She said the issue was not whether individual doctors or nurses were malicious. The issue was that the system gave them unchecked power over vulnerable people, and that when evidence of harm emerged, the system protected itself rather than the patients. She said the photograph was important, not because it showed 3 women with wrapped hands, but because it showed a hospital superintendent who knew those women had been harmed, who removed their restraints just long enough to take a picture, and who then used that picture to raise money. She said that was not medicine. That was a con. The room went quiet. Tarrant tapped his pen on the table. He said the state was willing to go further than the original offer. They would agree to a formal acknowledgement, a public exhibit on the history of asylum abuses in New York, and a process for descendants to access their ancestors' records with fewer restrictions. They would fund an independent historical review. But they would not admit that the commitments were wrongful or that the state was legally liable. He said that was the best they could do. The plaintiffs' attorneys caucused privately. The families were divided. Some wanted vindication in court. Others wanted the state to acknowledge the truth, even if it came with legal caveats. After 2 hours, they agreed to the terms, with one addition. The photograph would be the centerpiece of the public exhibit, and the exhibit materials would include the names and stories of Anna Dietrich, Margaret Coyle, and Rose Kaminsky, as well as a broader explanation of how the commitment system had been used to control women who defied social expectations. The state agreed. The settlement was finalized in March 2020, just as the world shut down for the pandemic. The public exhibit, planned for the State Museum in Albany, was delayed. It finally opened in September 2021 in a gallery on the 3rd floor. The exhibit was called Hidden in Plain Sight: Women, Asylums, and the Performance of Care. The photograph was enlarged and mounted on the wall, with a detailed caption explaining what the wrapped hands meant, who the women were, and how the image had been used. Next to it were Anna Dietrich's commitment papers, a page from Mrs. Alcott's daily notes, and a letter written by Rose Kaminsky's daughter, who had been 2 years old when her mother was committed and never saw her again. The exhibit also included testimony from a former nurse named Grace Tolliver, who had worked at another New York asylum in the 1910s and had written a private memoir that her granddaughter donated to the project. Tolliver described the routine of preparing for inspections, the hurried removal of restraints, the scramble to hide soiled bedding, the silent threats made to patients who might complain. She wrote, "We made it look like a place of healing, but it was a warehouse for women no one wanted to deal with. We were told to keep them quiet, keep them out of sight, and keep them working. That was the job." Descendants of other women came forward after the exhibit opened. Some brought photographs of their own, images they had been told showed great-grandmothers or great-aunts who had gone away for rest. Some of those photographs, when examined closely, showed similar details: awkward hand positions, faint marks, carefully staged scenes that looked peaceful until you knew what to look for. The museum collected these images and added them to a digital archive. Dr. Garrison wrote an accompanying essay that placed the photographs in the broader context of 19th century gender politics, immigrant discrimination, and the use of medical authority to enforce social control. The reaction was mixed. Some praised the exhibit as overdue honesty. Others, particularly some hospital foundations and historical societies, complained that it unfairly maligned institutions that had also done good work. There were letters to the editor, op-eds, and arguments on local history forums. A few, descendants of doctors who had worked at the hospitals, pushed back, saying their ancestors had been compassionate people working within the constraints of their time. Dr. Rice, the hospital advocate, participated in a panel discussion at the museum and said the exhibit was valuable, but that it should also acknowledge the real progress that had been made. She pointed out that involuntary commitment laws had been reformed, that patient advocates now had legal standing, and that mechanical restraints were banned in most settings. Vollmer attended the opening of the exhibit. She stood in front of the photograph for a long time, studying the faces of the women on the benches. She thought about how many people had looked at this image over the decades and seen only a pleasant garden scene. She thought about how easy it had been to miss the truth, because the truth was hidden in details that seemed small until you understood what they meant. She thought about Anna Dietrich, who had wanted only to grieve her child in peace, and Rose Kaminsky, who had been locked up for being poor and foreign, and Margaret Coyle, who had dared to question her brother's inheritance. None of them had been sick. They had been expendable. Joan Dietrich, Anna's descendant, also came to the opening. She brought her teenage daughter, who had never heard the story. They stood together in front of the photograph, and Joan explained what had happened to their ancestor. She told her daughter that for 100 years, their family had been told Anna died in a hospital after a nervous breakdown, that it was a tragedy but also a private shame. She said they had believed that story because they had no reason not to. Now, she said, they knew the truth. Anna had been imprisoned, tortured, and erased, but she was not erased anymore. Old photographs are not neutral. They are arguments, carefully composed to show power, respectability, and control. The asylum photographs of the 19th century were especially calculated. They were made to reassure the public that the people inside those walls were being cared for, that the money being spent was money well spent, that the individuals confined there were patients, not prisoners. But photographs are also evidence. They capture more than their makers intended. A hand wrapped in cloth, a faint mark on a wrist, a blank expression where there should be relief. All of these things can be read differently when you know what you are looking at. Across the country, there are thousands of images like this one, tucked into historical society files, museum collections, and family albums. Most of them are labeled with bland descriptions: patients in garden, ward activity, therapy session. Most of them have never been examined closely. If they were, some of them would tell the same story this one does. They would reveal the gap between the performance of care and the reality of control. They would show us that the people in those images, the people sitting still and staring into the camera, were not always there by choice and not always treated with dignity. They were often there because someone with power found them inconvenient, and the law allowed that inconvenience to be medicalized and hidden away. The photograph from the Hudson Valley State Hospital hangs now in the State Museum, no longer a relic of compassionate care, but a document of institutional violence. It reminds anyone who looks at it that history is not settled, that the stories we inherit are often incomplete, and that sometimes the truth is right there in front of us, waiting in the details we almost missed. The women in that garden were posed as proof of healing, but their hands told a different story. And now, more than a century later, someone finally listened.